Everybody out there, radio or internet lands. So today we have a very special guest today. We're joined by journalist Kathryn Joyce, who has written a series of articles for Salon.com about the kind of right-wing attack on public education. Something that we've talked about on the show last couple of weeks, and I really recommend all of our listeners check this series out because it really does have a lot of really important explanatory power about all of the current stories we're seeing, whether it's parents flooding into PTA meetings about critical race theory, and I use the air quotes because we'll probably get into why it's air quotes anyway. So before we get in, just Kathryn Joyce, can you tell the listeners, viewers, just a little bit about yourself, just who you are as a journalist, and also why kind of your impetus for writing this series of articles. So one of the things that struck me is it's kind of centered on Hillsdale College, which is about 75 or so miles from right here in Kalamazoo, not far at all, and you really do a good job like painting it or at least explaining its role in a lot of these again, like kind of right-wing attacks on education. So yeah, again, just please introduce yourself and then maybe tell the folks a little bit about why you decided, or what got you interested in writing about Hillsdale College and this series of articles that you did at Salon.
Sure. Well, and Andrew, thank you so much for having me. I am an investigative reporter at Salon. I have been there just since January. Before that, for many years, I was a freelancer. So I, kind of have will travel. I wrote for a lot of different publications. I worked a lot with Type Investigations, which used to be the Nation Institute Investigative Fund. But since joining Salon, I have been an investigative reporter focused primarily on covering the right wing. I come from a background of covering the religious right primarily, but then in the last, I don't know, I guess 8 years or so, I've been branching out to cover other aspects of the right, including and beyond the religious right. And in the last year, a lot of my work has definitely taken me into education, just because that has become such a massive battleground on the right in general for, all of the reasons that you just described, and, so many other attacks that are sort of percolating up now. And yeah, Hillsdale, this series, we were working on it for almost a couple of months, which in kind of the daily news churn of Salon is an awful long time. And, I can talk more about, how I kind of got tapped into that story if you'd like, but it really seemed to emerge as this school. It's a private Christian college. I'm sure most of your listeners in Michigan are familiar with it, but a private Christian college in southern Michigan that only has about 1,500 students, so not a huge school by any means. In some ways fairly obscure, but it has just this massive footprint in right-wing politics. It has just become, I don't know, the kind of the central point of an awful lot of different kinds of activism.
Oh yeah, and I think one of the things that your series does really well, and something we try to really bring home listeners on the home. These ideas don't just grow out of a cabbage patch. There's usually some sort of like big money or big institution attached to a lot of them. And I think one of the things that your series does really well is it walks your readers through kind of the pipeline of ideas. So as they're formulated at place like Hillsdale, all the way down the street level, where you have kind of, we mentioned at the top, these concerned parents who've been listening to a lot of this right-wing propaganda, like storming their PTA meetings and such. Maybe it's about critical race theory or their assumption of what that is. Maybe again, we've explained this on the show a little bit. Maybe we can talk a little bit about you know what it really is versus kind of the how it's been turned into a right-wing scare word. But I was wondering if you could just kind of parse out, kind of walk our listeners through that pipeline, how these tactics and ideas are disseminated from think tanks like Hillsdale College down to the street level.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so Hillsdale College, I mean, it does have a lot of money. So it's not poor. It's got almost $1 billion endowment, which for a school of that size is really remarkable. But that said, it's not really focusing. It's not like acting as a major source of money for the movement, but rather I think it's kind of a hub for ideas. A lot. Hillsdale College, I guess, just to start out, it prides itself on what it describes as its classical education. So they mean that both in the terms of how they educate, their pedagogy, but also their content. So there is a really significant focus at Hillsdale, and then in its network of public charter schools, which I'm sure we'll get into, on teaching about the Western tradition. And so there's other schools in the country that do that, other book schools that have often what's called like a great books curriculum. The students for a couple of years or 1 year or the entire college experience are studying largely the same curriculum, and it's kind of starting with the Greeks and then just going forward through the classic Western canon of great books. And so Hillsdale has a version of that, but it's also, particularly in the last 22 years, since its current president, a guy named Larry Arnn, who came to Hillsdale from the Claremont Institute, which is a think tank out in California, and it is, it has become associated in the last 6 years with really pretty, far right politics. It really established itself as the think tank that was sort of retroactively coming up with a conservative intellectual justification for Trumpism. It is the home still of John Eastman, the guy who wrote the infamous memo laying out how Mike Pence, could, in his mind, legally intervene and overturn the 2020 election. So Claremont Institute is a pretty far right place. Larry Arnn was a co-founder of that institute and led it for some years, and then came to Hillsdale. And after he had been there for a few years, he started trying to envision how Hillsdale, which had already had this reputation as being this conservative citadel. This is one of the bastions of conservative intellectualism in the United States before Arnn arrived, but he wanted to kind of expand that footprint. So around 2010, he established, with the help, interestingly enough, of Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, he established a Washington, D.C. campus right on Capitol Hill. It was right across the street from the Heritage Foundation. They worked with the Heritage Foundation. They worked with the Federalist Society, which, if your listeners don't know it, is the entity that is basically responsible for the fact that our judiciary.
You're naming some big ones off the rogues gallery there.
Yeah.
So
well, I mean, they had a fellowship for senior Capitol Hill staff to work and learn and refine their ideas with the Federalist Society and Hillsdale's Washington campus. So that's one reason. Hillsdale also became, particularly in, I don't know, the last 10 years or so, 5 or 10 years, this sort of big stop on right-wing speaking tours. So if there are, just like on the left or in the center, there are institutions that are, hospitable to come and, if you are a conservative intellectual, if you are a conservative politician, like this is a place to go and sort of be seen, to get your message out. If you are, on the campaign trail, if you are thinking about, running for president, this is a likely place that you are going to go. But also a lot of right-wing intellectuals do as well. So you were talking about CRT, quotes very much there. Chris Rufo, the Manhattan Institute conservative intellectual who is widely attributed for popularizing critical race theory as a moral panic. He went and shared his ideas at Hillsdale pretty early on. He was just there again last week, interestingly, talking about how, conservatives need to start going after cultural institutions and companies that the right sees as having been, taken over by liberal ideology. I feel like I'm getting a little bit far afield here, but in these different ways, Hillsdale has emerged as just this kind of intellectual center for a lot of the stuff that goes on in the right. When they have those people come and speak, they often, not always, but those speeches get adapted as essays for Hillsdale's monthly publication, which is called Imprimis, that they claim has a 6 million person readership, actually in excess of 6 million. So, when I was researching, I came across comments from conservatives saying that, if they have something printed in Imprimis, that actually gets more widely seen. It gets more attention, more reaction than something that's published in one of the big name conservative magazines or periodicals.
Interesting. And again, like a lot of new information. And I'm glad you mentioned the whole the strategy of like going after like corporations or institution they see as liberal. Again, recently we've seen this kind of backlash against corporations like Disney and such, very like hysterical extent. And yeah, it's important to sketch out like where these sorts of things come from. So I was wondering if you could dive in a little bit more, and you do that. The first article in your series does this really well. If you could sketch out just a little bit about the relevant history of Hillsdale, and I mean, I think you did a little bit answering the last question, but maybe dive just a little bit deeper into kind of the pertinent history around Hillsdale and how it ended up becoming a focal point of this current right-wing push against education, because like I mentioned, some of those names like the Heritage Foundation, Federalist Society, those are names that maybe some of my listeners who've done their reading might know, but a lot of them probably haven't heard necessarily about Hillsdale in the same way. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, an interesting, very deep part of their history is that Hillsdale was an abolitionist college. It was founded in the 1840s, I believe 1848, if I'm remembering correctly, as an abolitionist college. They have this story that during the Civil War, Hillsdale just emptied out. All of the, I presume, pretty uniformly men who were there at that time, emptied out, and they went to fight in the Civil War on the side of the Union. They hosted Frederick Douglass there. They are very proud of that. I believe there's a statue of him on their campus. They have this sort of bizarre looking kind of statuary walk that has statues of like Ronald Reagan leaning against a lamppost and Margaret Thatcher looking very stern. And Frederick Douglass, I believe, is in that collection as well.
When
And
I
it was
think
also,
sorry. When I think
no,
Frederick Douglass, I think about Margaret Thatcher. No, so
yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, absolutely. No, peas in a pod.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and they were also, I believe, notably one of the very first, if not the first, colleges to be open to people of all races. So they, back, from the earliest days, were a desegregated college, about 100 years before even most public institutions in the United States were. I mean, so that is a very interesting backstory for what they are now. I spoke to some people who had been there before Larry Arnn's term. He came on board in 2000. Apologies for this siren that's going by. But he came on in 2000 after, and I won't go into this much, but this really sort of tragic and bizarre scandal at Hillsdale where the previous president was accused of having an affair with his own son's wife, so his daughter-in-law, that then is, alleged to have ended in her suicide. And so this was something that, people were really concerned was going to derail this institution that had become, again, what they call like the citadel of conservatism. But I spoke to people who had been there in the 90s and the 80s, and they said, yes, always conservative. And somebody who was there in the 80s said, they were there at the heyday of the Reagan era. There was this sense of excitement on campus that, this conservative movement that they were a part of by being at a conservative college, was ascendant at that time. But, the person I spoke to, who has, since become a progressive and public education advocate, said, it wasn't, in her words, crazy. It wasn't embracing kind of the extreme ideas that are just really circulating on the right today. And she said by the end of her time there, you could see kind of the very beginning stages of that coming, that, again, in her words, that homeschooling survivalist families were starting to become, part of the background of the students who were coming there. Fast forwarding a little bit to Larry Arnn, I think he was coming armed with, all of these deep movement conservative connections. And just as an aside, I think, there can be a tendency among liberals to treat the right wing dismissively, to treat people on the right as though they are stupid or yokels, not sophisticated. And I think that's very much not the case. There is, however much, we all might disagree with it, there is an awful lot of, rigorous kind of intellectual work happening at places like conservative colleges and think tanks. And so this was really, an injection of that sort of world, from the think tank world, bringing kind of all of that really kind of intellectual right-wing movement energy into the college. And, from my observations, it seemed like this drove a lot of the ways that Hillsdale ended up, becoming such a central, if overlooked, part of the conservative movement. In addition to establishing this campus in Washington, D.C., they have set up education centers in a variety of places around the country. They have, if I don't know if you have the Friendly's restaurant chain out in Michigan, that might be kind of a northeastern restaurant chain, but one of the founders of the Friendly's restaurant chain, it's kind of like a hot dog and ice cream sort of place, ended up bequeathing most of his estate or much of his estate, which includes this exact replica of Monticello, to Hillsdale so they could establish one of their education centers there. They've just bought property outside Sacramento to build at least one center in California. Just in this past December, they set up a new academy for freedom and science, I think is what it's called, that is in Washington, D.C. And it has three senior fellows in its kind of inaugural class. And they are all people who are very notable for being big COVID-19 public health measures skeptics. Two people who signed this sort of infamous document that, to paraphrase, was basically advocating the kind of the letter rip model of responding to the pandemic. And then one of the people who was an advisor to Trump in his pandemic response, who was very skeptical of a lot of public safety measures. So they've got all these they have their fingers in a lot of different pies at the same time. And then at the same time that they were establishing the Washington campus, they also started offering these online courses. So kind of bringing Hillsdale style classes to the public by offering these free online lecture series that anybody could sign up for, and which they claim have been viewed by some 3.5 million people to date. And they're teaching on subjects like the Constitution, the founding fathers, kind of the setup of the government. I mean, there's other things too. There's literature, there's kind of religious studies stuff as well. But I think it seems to me some of the most formative, and the ones that I saw people commenting most on online are their, Constitution sort of 101 and 201 courses. And so that's sort of, it's propagating this very conservative interpretation of the Constitution and how the US is run. And it's helping spread this very conservative read on the country and on our founding documents that basically suggests that most things having to do with the social safety net are not provided for in our government. Perhaps extending as well to various forms of education. And also, and again, we can get into this when you want, also at the same time, they set up this charter school network where they were helping to spread kind of in the same way that, some evangelical churches are church planting churches. They go and they set up all these little satellites that then kind of grow into a big network. And then it becomes like a big church network. In the same way, this Hillsdale-based initiative called Barney Charter School Initiative is planting all of these different charter schools around the country that are, following a Hillsdale curriculum that, again, is really focused on, Western classical civilization. This idea that, this is kind of a pinnacle of human achievement, and going along with that, kind of a lot of conservative bugaboos. So responding to this perception that normal public schools are constantly denigrating the U.S. history and the West in general. It's setting itself up sort of as this champion of the West, that they are going to instill in people this appreciation for classical Western civilization from the Greeks through America today, and that America is sort of the pinnacle of Western society. And so they're doing this around the country. They have a couple dozen of these schools that are fully members of the charters. They have another 30 or so schools that are using Hillsdale's curriculum, so without being full-on charters. And it's also important to note that these are public schools. Charter schools, the public charters that they are establishing are paid for with taxpayer money. And they come with all of the same baggage that all charter schools do, in that if a charter school gets set up, it is ultimately going to be drawing money away from the public school system. It is going to weaken the public school system. It's going to draw, oftentimes many of the best performing students away from public schools. So it is leaving the public schools with students who have higher needs, more expensive needs, and at the same time leaving them with much less money to meet those needs. So that might be a little bit, getting ahead of ourselves, but it really it has branched out into all these different kind of spheres of influence.
If you don't mind, I think I do have a couple of questions specifically
Sure.
about the charter study, and I think both of them kind of lead off everything you were just talking about. But I would just maybe just really succinctly, could you explain? So I think me reading this, I was a little taken aback, and I think a lot of the listeners will be. You described something called the Barney Initiative in your reporting, and it's like, how do these charter schools that have this very obvious like religious extreme ideological bent, how do they get those tax dollars to begin with? Is there some sort of technicality or something? And that'll also lead into another follow-up question. But I'm just curious, like just nuts and bolts. How are these schools getting money if it's very obvious that they're these kind of far right Christian institutions?
I mean, it, it may be far obvious, and it's also, not the way they present themselves. The way these schools present themselves, because charter schools, the process varies, in different locations, but generally speaking, they need to go before a local school board, or a local kind of county educational authority to uh, to receive, permission to establish their charter. They usually have to have some sort of authorizing agent, whether or not that's, a government body, or sometimes it's local colleges can serve as sort of that authorizer. But they are not presenting themselves as religious and right-wing schools. Even if, as you look at some of their websites and you read, not even necessarily between the lines, but sometimes just read the straight text, it's pretty clear where that's coming from. But while Hillsdale itself is very much a private Christian college, and a private K-12 school that it also runs on its campus, Hillsdale Academy, that is a private school, and it's very much a private Christian school where kids have Bible lessons and chapel services, and they have chaplains come and give them lectures on the Bible. When it comes to the charter schools, they're in many ways using the same or very similar curriculum for the academics, but the religious element is sublimated a little bit. So instead of having outright scripture recitation, which is something that has to happen at Hillsdale's private K-12 schools, students are expected to memorize the Bible, or portions of it. Instead of that, at the Hillsdale's charter, there is this just abiding emphasis on virtue, that it's part of the mission of these charter schools to instill virtue, and that it's also part of them to teach about the quote unquote Judeo-Christian heritage. And I put quotes around that because most religion scholars will say Judeo-Christian that's not actually a real tradition. That's sort of a propagandistic term, a subject for another day. But they're teaching that, they say, as history rather than as Bible class. Sometimes it seems to amount to one and the same thing. There have been reports from some of the Hillsdale charter schools, from former instructors there, that those schools ended up bringing in chaplains to lecture the students, to preach to the students, really, about the Judeo-Christian foundings of the United States. That America was founded basically on Christian principles, or Judeo-Christian principles, they sometimes say, to make it seem in kind of a very superficial way, as though it's slightly more inclusive than it is. But they're doing that. And if you look at the websites of some of these schools, one that I focused on a lot in Orange County, California, its founders are pretty dedicated right-wing activists, and so they are pretty overt in the sorts of things that they say. And so they talked about their school as a place that was proudly focusing on the Western tradition, that they considered this the heritage of all of their students, regardless of what their students actual backgrounds are. So if it is a student from another country, by virtue of being in America, they're saying Western heritage is now your heritage, that's what you're going to learn about. They will say, and some of this stuff is just kind of intentionally combative response to discussions around how to deal with teaching about history of racism, or sexism and misogyny, or kind of various bigotries in US history. They will say, where it's appropriate, we will acknowledge that some of the historical figures we will be teaching about did things that we don't agree with today, like be slave owners. But we're not going to dwell on it. We're not going to hold people accountable to modern standards. And we're not going to try to have any sort of representative mix of, the people, the authors that we are teaching, the figures that we are citing. We're not going to try to have that be representative to the demographics of the school or to the society that the school is based in. So they're basically saying kind of upfront in this fairly combative way, we are mostly, they are actually literally saying in a quote, we will mostly be teaching white men because white men wrote most of the best works of literature, philosophy, science, et cetera, in the tradition that we're teaching from. So it's really kind of this aggressive stance. How this gets passed, I mean, they are presenting themselves when they go to apply as, this is a charter school that's going to offer, this unique educational experience to students. There is this demand for it. And sometimes, in the case of Orange County, sometimes they are going before extremely sympathetic school boards. So in the case at Orange County, that Barnard Charter School Initiative charter called Orange County Classical Academy, it was going before a county board of education that has a 4-to-1, not just conservative, but pretty right-wing majority. It is chaired by a woman who is married to the man who launched this charter school. She works for a California right-wing think tank. They have received really shockingly unusual amounts of donations from both right-wing leaders and organizers and think tanks, as well as charter school PACs and lobbying organizations. So in an area where typically school board races are run with, $5,000 or maybe, $20,000 tops, one of these candidates was running with $500,000, which is, it's a shocking amount of money for a local kind of low-level bureaucratic office. But this is sort of what we are seeing, is that there has been, along with these campaigns to get angry parents to sort of bombard school boards around the country with complaints, there is also a very concerted campaign to get them elected to those positions. And some of that has been going on, for a number of years before people were really paying attention to it as they are now. Sorry, that was
Yeah,
sort of
no,
long-winded.
no, like that's really important to bring up. And again, like that's definitely something we've been seeing, again, money pouring into these low-level races. So you talked a little bit about their curriculum, and I think that spurs this question that came up. And it's something that we talk about a lot whenever we're talking about education on the show. But your article, it describes a lot of some of the revisionist history that entities like Hillsdale are pushing, or sometimes often it can be just kind of history by omission. They omit some of the parts that make the founding myths look less good, or I guess less black and white. And one thing I found particularly interesting, there's an excerpt about them describing progressive education. And they said that just to quote, it reduces education to a vocationally focused utilitarian enterprise that merely equips students with the skills required for future jobs. And what really struck me about that is that that's almost verbatim kind of what, if I were to ask like a leftist or an anti-capitalist what their main criticism of the American education system is, they'd probably have an answer very similar to that. So there's a couple things going on here. I was wondering if you could parse out kind of the way that not only Hillsdale, but a lot of these right-wing institutions will get into like a particular kind of like kernel of truth, a something that is it's something that like working people can recognize as a problem, in this case with the education system, but kind of divert them in a different direction instead of like analyzing that systemically. It's like, oh, it's because it's some democratic leftist is doing it, etc. And also just the broader, I guess, like we on our show we like to call it the Disneyfication of American history, the way that again we talk conservatives tend to really just uplift the exceptionalism and the big myths while leaving out some of the nasty but very important parts of American history to talk about as well. So I know that that's kind of a dense question, but feel free to unpack that however you'd like. Oh, your mic is muted. Sorry.
This is the bane of the last couple of years. I think I'll start with the last part first. I should have mentioned this straight up in describing Hillsdale's influence, but Larry Arnn, the president who I was speaking about before, he headed Donald Trump's 1776 commission, which you'll probably remember that's the commission that Trump set up really in the last couple of months of his reelection campaign, it was framed very explicitly as a response to the 1619 project, that New York Times project that was, trying to underscore and make the argument that slavery was such a foundational part of the founding of the United States that really we should look further back than the literal founding of our country to see how slavery and everything that it has wrought since then has shaped the United States. Obviously, that was, has proved so explosive among the right wing. It's something that is driving a lot of the, anti-critical race theory panic today. But there's Trump, as kind of one of his closing re-election bids, set up this 1776 commission that was going to kind of come up with a concerted explicit response to the 1619 project, and so they did that. Larry Arnn ran it. Another one of Hillsdale's administrative leaders ended up serving as the third in command in that effort, and they put out this report that came out in the days after January 6th in 2021, and historians reviewed it and just absolutely panned it. They said, this is the most jingoistic thing that we have ever seen. This is not historical scholarship. But then while the Biden administration basically undid the 1776 commission, they ended the project on Biden's first day in office. Fast forward to that July, so last July, Hillsdale College put out a 1776 curriculum. So this whole new curriculum, it is massive. It's like there are 2,400 pages of it so far, and they say that this is just one part of it. And this is supplements the rest of the curriculum that their charter schools and their other member schools are already using. And it's hard to kind of summarize something that large in what it does, but it just has a very, very rosy view of US history of racial discrimination. Larry Arnn's argument has been that, all education does today is focus on the warts of American history. And we want to show, both sides. We want to show the beauty as well. But what ends up coming out of that project is this argument that, all of the founding fathers, even the ones who, were slavers, were actually closet abolitionists, and they were crafting the Constitution in such a way that it would ultimately abolish slavery. They come up with these, arguments around the civil rights movement that historians, again, have reviewed and just say are ludicrous. Claiming that Martin Luther King Jr. never wanted to use the law to address discrimination and racism and segregation, but he was just really making this heartfelt appeal to people's individual consciences. And then they have this big and notable argument that, MLK was great, we all love MLK, but almost immediately, well, first, basically racism was ended in the 1960s, civil rights movement did its job, and it's all done. And then their second part of their argument is that almost immediately after the civil rights movement, all of that noble energy to address segregation and discrimination immediately became corrupted and co-opted and turned towards what they consider this very toxic development of, they call it identity politics, anything basically that is meant to actually address in any sort of systemic way, the facts of discrimination. So they cast this as something that is a betrayal of King's legacy, which is just ahistorical. That is, the claims they are making are, historians have looked at this and said that's just not true. That is not how King thought about these things. But it's in service of this argument that, now that it's safely passed, the civil rights movement was great, but then it got corrupted and turned into something which is a familiar conservative argument, to be sure, but this is now formalized in a curriculum that, it's not just being shared at, these couple of dozen charter schools that are in existence already, and, the 30 or so other schools that are using Hillsdale's curriculum, but it's something that is spreading even more, and that conservative politicians are hoping to institutionalize. At the end of January, in his State of the State Union, the governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, he announced that he was formalizing a partnership with Hillsdale to open a whole new bevy of Hillsdale charter schools across Tennessee, and to institute the lessons of its 1776 curriculum, which he thought was just, the best curriculum he'd ever seen. And Hillsdale itself has said that Governor Lee initially asked him to build 100 charter schools there, and they've compromised to launch 50. So, this is kind of the potential to institutionalize this model on a fairly massive scale. And that would do a lot to kind of cement the spread of that, as you say, kind of Disneyfied American history. In terms of, the first part of what you were asking about, I found that really fascinating as well. And I'm not an education historian, but I talked to a couple to try to understand what was the argument that they were making. So you were talking about, how Hillsdale argues that progressive education reduces education to just job training. And, that is definitely the argument that they made to me. When I spoke to two different education historians about this, they said that's not what progressive education was about. If you look back and you actually look at what progressive education pioneers like John Dewey were doing, it was an effort to transform what used to be a really extremely regimented form of classroom learning, from a setting where students, like, desks were bolted to the ground. It was kind of extremely disciplinarian. All the kids were learning by rote memorization, to transform that into classrooms that were a lot more child-centered, where, these historians were explaining to me that, it was about project-based education. So, like, kids learning how to do things by, like, acting them out, sometimes by drawing in, examples from real life. So I guess maybe that's partly where they're talking about kind of the vocational focus, because sometimes it would mean, like applying, learning math by applying it to, a project that you're working on with tactile materials. But they said this is just kind of an unrecognizable description of progressive education, that really what it was about was getting to something that is more child focused. But I think it's also, I spent a fair amount of time trying to kind of parse, what this meant. And Hillsdale answered some of my questions. They did not answer my questions about this. So I was sort of left trying to piece together, what these attacks were meant based on things that Arne has said. And I mean, it just seems like that there is this conflation in the 1776 curriculum, in the statements that Arne has made, in Hillsdale's basic Barney curriculum that schools were already using before this past year, of conflating this idea of progressive education, which means something really specific, with the progressive era, an era of reform coming at the end of the Gilded Age, that included a lot of reforms of the obscene excesses and abuses of capitalism, at the end of the 19th century, included just an awful lot of reforms, conflating those two things. And I think also conflating it with the progressivism, that we use as a term today to describe a political position. So all of those things seemed to sort of be shading together, blending together in some different ways in how they were talking about this, to, I think, just kind of tar all of these concepts by association in the minds of the conservative parents and teachers and potential charter school operators, I guess, that they are speaking to.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we see that with again, things like critical race theory, which as we talked about on the show, is you're not really learning that unless you're in law school, but it's been turned into this kind of dog whistle for like anything bad that makes your children uncomfortable about race. And there's something that you mentioned, it ties into a question I wanted to ask. So they're talking about like how they feel education today only shows all the warts of American history. And if we look back, this is one very recent and definitely not a widespread phenomenon. It is still very much the norm for most education, K through 12 education in the United States, to still be teaching things like, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and maybe some other stuff happened, but you won't learn that until you're in college. Where I'm going with that is that's still a very like minor thing, but it seems like there's this tendency to seeing that is starting to gain some traction is looked at as like a full-scale threat. And this is something we see a lot with not just like kind of the Hillsdale playbook, but with kind of right-wing stuff across the board, is this tendency to kind of paint themselves as the aggrieved underdog, or we are under attack, we are under assault, and even when objectively they pretty much hold all the levers of power, the Supreme Court. A lot of this stuff was starting under the Trump administration. They literally had all three branches of government. And, effectively now you can't really get any left of center legislation through anyway. So even while basically having all the levers of power of the US government, there's still this tendency to paint themselves as like this culturally aggrieved, or what's the word, under siege. And I was wondering if you could talk about like what is the political utility of that for kind of Hillsdale and then like-minded think tanks, and like how do they use that strategically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and I've thought a lot about that over the years, because I feel like that has been a commonality to a lot of the groups that I've reported on. I don't know if I have a brilliant answer to that. I mean, I think, I think fighting from the position of, the underdog, or seeing yourself as an underdog, often feels like it carries more moral weight for people. I think obviously, like, casting things in sort of apocalyptic terms, that we are at war, there's a war on parents, that there's a war on the country, there's a war on history, there's war on white people. yes, that's kind of obviously just kind of amplifying people's anxiety. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question why so much of this is sort of framed in the terms of victimization. Uh, I was in it for an unrelated piece yesterday. I spoke with a really smart writer and journalist named David Nywert, who also reports on the right, and I was asking him his thoughts about uh, something very dumb, but Republicans trying to sort of turn the tables and accuse Biden, who just made some extremely banal, small talky kind of comments about the weather, and trying to turn this around and say, like, look, Biden is evoking um, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory because he thanked his nominee, who is Jewish, for bringing the good weather today. Um, this is all, it's kind of too dumb to talk about, except there is a purpose behind this stuff, and in some ways, Dave Nywert was saying, this has been a favored right-wing tactic for a long time to adopt and appropriate sort of the logic of the left and try to turn it around and use it against the left. So if the left is pointing out, usually, almost always, in more serious and legitimate ways, instances of bias and bigotry, or the deployment of, in that example, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or rhetoric on the part of, the right-wing political leaders or intellectual leaders. They're sort of defanging that a little bit by picking up the most absurd and just nonsensical of examples and trying to throw that back. But I think a little bit, you can see that you can apply that same principle to kind of a broader strategy to cast themselves in the role of, being victimized, that, to sort of constantly try to turn those tables and say it's the left who are kind of the real racists, because they are trying to divide our children into racial groups, and our children wouldn't see race if if leftist teachers weren't constantly pointing out to them, or it, in a slightly altered way, I think, with this new really obscene campaign to paint LGBTQ people and educators as groomers, to call them pedophiles if they acknowledge their or anybody else's non-heterosexuality or non-binary gender identity, that this is tantamount to a threat of child sex abuse. I mean, there are, I think, I don't know, I mean, my only observation, I guess, is that feels like a stronger moral position to come from, to say, to paint yourself as you're on the defensive, fighting somebody who is attacking you, rather than to be going out and perpetrating that sort of discrimination directly.
Oh yeah, no, you put a really fine point, and I think you're kind of wrapping that into, because that's something that we've been thinking a lot about on, on the show, just activists. It's like, it's uh, not only that. I think a lot of it has to do with, finding scapegoats and also justification. I think a lot of this you wouldn't be able to get away with in a modern context, because like you can't just be bigoted or at least broadly, you shouldn't be bigoted against LGBTQ people. But a lot of we're seeing peddled in a lot of these far right media channels is kind of giving people an excuse to be hateful and sometimes engage in stochastic violence against people who are objectively still dealing with a lot of oppression and violence themselves. Um, and so I wanted to kind of go back, and I have just a couple more questions. One really puts a fine point on, charter schools and the overall agenda of, what they want to do with public education. But I did have a question kind of going back to, COVID. And I know you mentioned, especially in the first article, talking about some of the links between Hillsdale people and COVID denialism. And this is something that people have been really having to deal with all over the country. Public safety measures have been politicized in a way that we haven't really seen elsewhere. Even here in Kalamazoo's largely kind of seen as a liberal college town. But even we have noticed an escalated level of aggressiveness and kind of pointedness around these issues. Like I think back to like last year or maybe 2 years ago. Sorry, kind of pandemic soup last couple of years. But yeah, we even had like some more kind of anti-mask parents who were I remember online one of them like basically threatened to tell on the school board to Tucker Carlson, trying to like draw that sort of national attention. So I'm curious if you could kind of draw especially as we might be looking at this new variant coming in and we might be needing to do some of these safety measures again and thinking about the reemergence of the backlash to that. Could you parse out a bit how that is factored into not only the current right wing assault on education, but what is the utility of groups like Hillsdale and these other right wing groups in politicizing these sort of baseline safety measures?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think you asked at the beginning, and I think I didn't fully answer. Apologies. Kind of how I got interested in this story, and it was actually really this connection that you're talking about. I mentioned that Hillsdale has set up this like new academy for science and freedom in Washington. That's basically just kind of a center for COVID skepticism, basically so far at least. And I watched one of their initial speaking events. It was Scott Atlas, the guy who used to be one of Trump's pandemic advisors. And I was watching that and, trying to see if there was, something interesting to report about it. And honestly, I just found it pretty boring. And so I was looking around online for, is there kind of some more context that I can find that will make this, a little bit more interesting than just, here's kind of another joker saying the same things that they always say. And then in that searching around, I stumbled on the fact that the co-founder of that particular Hillsdale charter in Orange County, California, south of LA, that I was speaking about before, that he was one of the co-founders of America's Frontline Doctors, which was this association of medical professionals who were just emerged in the summer of 2020 as big boosters of Trump's pandemic response and calling for opening everything immediately back then amid that first wave, when the virus was, in many cases, just, much more severe than some of the variants that we have seen subsequently. And, I was looking into him and he had come to national prominence through his anti-pandemic safety measures activism. He had, he just had become this kind of cartoonish figure who was going on live streams and like whipping out a gun and saying, this is a better protection than a mask, and belittling people who took rapid tests, saying that taking COVID-19 tests is the same thing as getting an unnecessary breast biopsy if you aren't at risk of, breast cancer. I mean, just really kind of absurd, over the top statements, and really involved in so many of the organizations that have been some of the noisiest kind of anti-public health measures actors over the last couple of years. And then he is also, his second big cause, or his other big cause, was this Hillsdale Charter School initiative, because he loved Hillsdale so much, because his son went there and he thought, this is a model that should be spread everywhere. And so I just thought it was interesting, and then kind of looking into the fact that his wife was on the board that was, poised to approve him to spread countywide, which they did, and that she had like all of these connections to right-wing think tanks that are connect to national groups. I was just like, this is like a whole snake ball of connections that I'm interested in unraveling and seeing, what all is involved in here. But at Hillsdale itself, I mean, they really also tapped into that pandemic resentment. They fundraised on the fact that they were, they had not closed, that they had not gone remote. Larry Arnn went around and at various different public speaking events, he actually joked about how, he hoped that his students wouldn't die, because what a hassle would that be? I mean, I'm not suggesting that he actually wants to see that happen, but it's a very cavalier way to speak about these things when so many people did die. And they actually recruited students on it. I mean, there was an essay that went kind of viral in, I think, February, where Barry Weiss, this sort of professional contrarian writer, published an essay by a woman who dropped out of Bryn Mawr and went to Hillsdale, claiming it was because, she was tired of the intellectual repression at a liberal arts school, or a progressive liberal arts school. And it turned out actually she left because she was an anti-vaxxer who refused to get a vaccine. I mean, but these politics, absolutely overlap. And I mean, I think, to me, it just indicates, I don't know, kind of how all of these different politics are sort of fusing into one thing. People might be motivated or care more about one particular thing over another. But it's all of these issues they're just becoming so much more part of really frozen identities. Probably we could say that of many different political perspectives, but very much so on the right. I mean, what should charter schools have to do with being skeptical about vaccines? On their surface, they don't have that many connections, and yet this guy in California advertised his charter as, we will be opening in the fall of 2020, no masks, no social distancing, no restrictions. Your kid is going to have a normal school experience. And so they are, you don't have to stretch to make these connections. They are just living them out. Like, they are, in many cases, one and the same activist fighting on multiple different fronts at once. I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it was a little Zoom fatigue there. Thank you. That was a really important explanation. And yeah, again, I think like, even those of us who really kind of follow the why of a lot of stuff, it does continue to boggle. Why things like COVID got turned into a political football. And I guess so the next thing I want to ask is maybe dive a little bit deeper into we're talking about the charter schools, and I was wondering if you could parse out how initiatives, like what Hillsdale is pushing and stuff are related to school choice proposals, the agenda of somebody in our area who's quite famous slash probably more infamous,
Mhm.
Betsy DeVos, largely views charters as a method to kind of defund public education. As a matter of fact, we were talking about this ballot proposal a couple weeks ago on the show. And I looked up. You recently wrote an article about that as well. So I wondered maybe you could tie those things together for us. Just talking a little bit about how this bleeds into the larger agenda of people like Betsy DeVos and what they're working on in Michigan to try to divert public funds into these charter schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, for one thing, DeVos, there are just the very overt, clear connections. She and her family have donated a substantial amount of money to Hillsdale. Her brother Eric Prince went to Hillsdale. Kind of the famous mercenary Eric Prince. So I mean, there are just those connections there. But there's also, I think, this deeper ideological commonality. Betsy DeVos very famously has been arguing for more than 2 decades that Christians, conservative Christians, should see kind of the sphere of public education as one of their most important battlegrounds. That even if rich Christian philanthropists like her family donated everything they had to setting up new private Christian schools, that would just be a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that is in the public education system. And so she, in this very famous, widely reported on event back in 2001, made this argument that, the public school system, if we can kind of wrest control of that, that can be an instrument for greater kingdom game, which is very evangelical language for advancing the kingdom of God. That this can be part of the mission field, basically. And so a lot of people, a lot of great journalists and scholars have looked at that over the years and tied that to both her advocacy before she became Secretary of Education, and then certainly while she was there. That was very much about uh, you know, pushing for vouchers. I think it was in 2000 that Michigan previously had a DeVos family backed voucher campaign, which they pumped, I think, almost $5 million into, and then failed because turns out, at least so far, it seems like Michigan does not want vouchers, that Michigan likes its public schools, as far as I can tell from the outside. Um, but then, certainly when she was Secretary of Education, she was, kind of consistently trying to find ways. Oh, did I freeze? Oh, am I there? Sorry, I think I froze for a second. That she's consistently has tried to find ways to direct public money towards private schools, to expand charter schools, during the pandemic to make money that should have gone to helping support public universities, making that available instead to private and religious schools. So she's definitely backed that in a lot of different ways. Where this ties to Hillsdale, I think, is that, for one thing, Hillsdale is, while they as a college have, made a lot of hay out of the fact that they refuse to accept any sort of federal funds, meaning they won't even accept students receiving, like Pell Grants. You can't use those for Hillsdale College because they don't want to be beholden to federal civil rights laws that would require them to, uphold Title IX or to report on levels of diversity at their school. And yet, at kind of a one step remove, all of the charter schools that are using their curriculum and spreading their ideas are doing so with public taxpayer dollars. Hillsdale itself has argued that education is one of the most important battlefields, that it's a tool and a weapon. The speakers who have come and spoken there have talked about a long-range conservative game plan that if you can get enough kids shifted out of the public school system, you will basically be able to collapse it by attrition. You will draw so many students and all the money that goes with those students, that it will basically undermine the entire kind of infrastructure of the public school system. And that, if you try to put it back together again later, you're not going to be able to. Like, once you've broken it, it's going to be pretty hard to fix. And they have been very explicit about making this case, saying, giving numbers of students. If we can get this number of students pulled out of the public school system and into choice, meaning into vouchers, voucher schools, charter schools, private schools, if you can do that, you'll have crossed the Rubicon. And even if you have the person who was saying this was from Florida, even if you have a Democratic administration come in after that, they're not going to be able to fix it. And so that is the level of kind of strategy that they are thinking at. And I think Betsy DeVos is really emblematic of that. So I think, with these ballot initiatives, people are concerned, that the same game plan is being deployed again in Michigan, that something is being presented as, this is just a scholarship opportunity. We are just enabling the creation of scholarships so that more, lower and middle income students could go to private school if they want. So it's a slightly backdoor way of doing it, is my understanding. But most of the public school advocates or Democrats who are opposed to this say this is just, Betsy DeVos trying to get her vouchers by another means. And, speaking to kind of that sense of all of these different issues are kind of coming together and fusing into kind of one kind of coalition platform. They have teamed up with some extremely far-right people in Michigan to push both that ballot initiative, as well as a number of others. And so I think they're, if they are willing to team up with people who, just a couple of years ago would have been considered unacceptably far right, too far beyond the pale. And now they are partnering with them in service of this shared agenda. I think, it's pretty important to pay attention to.
Thank you so much. And, like you said, I think it is really important to understand, we've talked on the show about the trajectory, a lot of these movements. I'd actually recommend folks, we did a great discussion about a month and a half ago with Reverend Nathan Dannison about the book, Jesus and John Wayne, which also is a book that really kind of charts out the development of kind of like the right-wing cultural ecosystem. But again, the way that all of these are starting to continue to radicalize and bring people in the fold who are more explicitly fanatical or fascistic. So I just have like one last question I'm gonna leave you with, and just to kind of summarize what we've talked about in the show. You've really sketched out how again, Hillsdale's role in this kind of, as I said, ecosystem of like right-wing think tanks, and how that's bleeding into a lot of what we're seeing to right now, kind of some of the grassroots and astroturfed backlash to perceived leftist indoctrination, etc. And also we're seeing like these anti-CRT bills, this explicit push against LGBTQ folks with like all these don't say gay bills, and in addition, what you're talking to, just a lot the way that a lot of these laws are designed, kind of making it easier for right-wing activists or parents to sue particular teachers and stuff. It's creating an environment where it's making it almost impossible to teach, which again is by design, and talk about how it's part of a larger agenda to really dismantle the education system. So wanted to just ask, like, and how you think folks can organize against it. And I noticed you also you wrote an article where you were talking to some educators who are currently trying to organize against this kind of far right assault on education. So I wonder if you maybe could parse out some observations, or some stuff that you gleaned from talking to those folks, as well as maybe just your own thoughts on what average ordinary people can do here in Kalamazoo, here in Michigan, and all over the country, to try to stem the tide of this war on education, as I guess some of the Hillsdale people would frame it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, the one thing is, one of the pieces that you were referencing, I spoke with the African American Policy Forum, which was founded actually by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is, often credited as, being one of the people who really came up with the theory of critical race theory, as it actually is, not as it's being caricatured so widely today. So I think that's one resource that people could look to. AAPF had been organizing a number of university and college faculty resolutions, so that the faculty at these schools of higher education, where typically still professors are expected to have academic freedom, that they could make statements of support to stand in solidarity with educators at the K-12 level in the public school system, who don't have that guarantee. Oh, did I freeze again? Sorry. Who don't have that guarantee of academic freedom. So, in some ways, I think those sorts of statements, that's seems to me like that could be a valuable thing to do. Also, a little while ago, I reported on something that happened in Florida, where there was a professor who is an expert in Southern civil rights history, a guy named Michael Butler at Flagler College, and he had been long scheduled to go and deliver a lesson to a group of, I think, third grade teachers in Central Florida about civil rights history. And he was supposed to go there, kind of talk to him about his research of civil rights history in Florida. And the local school board got anxious that this was going to be, cast as CRT, and it was going to get the local school system in trouble, and they canceled the whole event. And when I spoke with Professor Butler, he was really outspoken about it.
Kathryn, I think you're freezing up just a little bit. I'm hoping we can get you back to close this out. All right.
Gosh, this keeps freezing.
Okay, I can hear you now. So
Hey, can you hear
yeah,
me?
yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
the video's maybe it's still frozen. I'm sorry, my internet connection seems to be dying a bit here.
If you
Anyway,
want to finish out just using just audio, sometimes that could help. So
okay, yeah, maybe. Well, I'll just say quickly that he spoke out pretty clearly, because he said he was afforded that level of academic freedom that he knew his counterparts in K-12 schools were not. So, I mean, for people who've got that position where they can speak out, it seems like that would be something that would be good to do, to stand in solidarity.
all right. Well, Kathryn, again, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us, just kind of a local Southwest Michigan radio program. And again, we really value the incredible work and research that went into these articles, as well as the other ones we referenced on our show today. Just if people want to read your material, or follow you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Sure. Well, I'm writing these days exclusively at salon.com. So they can go and find my work there. I am not the most prolific tweeter, but I am on Twitter at KathrynAJoyce.com or Kathryn A. Joyce.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kathryn. And again, thank you
Thank
for,
you.
yeah. And you have yourself a fantastic day.
Same to you. Thanks so much, Andrew. Bye-bye.